Hello and welcome to my latest video. This time I'm going to be looking at how to paint the Nighthaunt Chainghast models, one of which you can see on the screen right now. And here it is in live video form. So I'm going to be covering all of the stages, so you learn how to paint the non-metallic metals in both the warm coppery gold colour and the chains as well. And also I'm going to be going over how to paint the red and the blue ghostly trails. So to start with, I've used an airbrush. It's not absolutely necessary to do it this way, it's just much quicker. So I primed it black. I used Mephiston red just to spray the very top of the model red. And then I used Sotek green, Lothern blue, and then a little bit of white added to the Lothern blue at the very tip of the tail. Then I went back over with Vallejo model colour black, and I painted in all the areas that are going to be different colours. This also helps to kind of just define the shapes a bit more, because what you'll find is once you've airbrushed on the red and blue, so bits like the chains and the face will obviously be red and blue. And so it looks a bit more messy, and by just painting in the black areas, one, it's going to make it a lot easier when you paint the non-metallic metal effects, because they won't be red, base coated or whatever. It also just helps, you know, to look at the model and see how it's how everything's defined more. It makes it look neater as well. So we're going to start off with the non-metallic gold face. The colours for this are the Vallejo model colours. There's English uniform, which is the colour we're starting with, and then we'll move on to Japanese uniform and ice yellow. They're all model colours, by the way, not game colours. Generally I don't like using game colours too much. They have different properties to the Vallejo model colour ones. They tend to be a bit more satin, they separate more easily and things like that. So when applying the English uniform, the first thing you need to do is decide where the light is going to hit. For this particular model, I'm painting it so the light is hitting straight down, so from above. So the strongest highlight points will be at the top of the face. Now obviously there's a cloak over the face, over the top of it anyway, so that makes it really easy to do the non-metallic metal on this, because it gives a sharp defined outline and a really dark edge right next to the highest point, which will make the highlight really stand out. And also because the face is turned down a little bit, so a lot of it is in shade, so you actually only have to paint quite a small area for highlights and things, because this kind of non-metallic metal works best with really high contrast. So there's going to be a lot of black kind of showing through on this. You don't want the paint too thin really, so a little bit, just around about single cream, maybe a little bit thicker. It's not the best covering paint, but it does the job, and because it's does have a small amount of transparency, if you want, you can. It's very easy to get a textured effect, so you can just do small marks and things like that, and build it up, and then you'll get a nice textured look. Or you can just keep applying layers, and you'll get a very smooth finish anyway. So you can see I'm just using the very tip of the brush. I dip it in the paint on the wet palette, then I rub it against my thumb, and that just draws the paint into a sharp tip, so that stops paint from blobbing when it touches the model, and it just allows me to get that really sharp point that you need for, well, you don't really need, but it allows you much better brush control. So you can see after I'd already done one layer that I'm now building up the opacity of the colour, so that it becomes a stronger colour, which is in effect increasing the highlight. because obviously the English uniform colour is lighter than the black base colour. So one thing you're going to notice quite quickly is that I'm going to take the model off of the painting stand, and there's a very good reason for that. And that's because for these models, they're only attached to the base with a very thin plastic tendrils coming, you know, the ghostly effect at the bottom. And what happens is, because it's such a thin bit of plastic, every time I touch the model with the brush it moves, which gets very, very frustrating. So normally I would always recommend using a model holder if you're painting something like this, because it stops you having to rub the paint off and get grease on the model, you know, which is really not ideal for painting. But in this case, quite soon, I think it is in the video, I'll take the model off the base, just because it just moves all the time. You can see every now and then, even when I just move it, the model moves a tiny amount, which is not ideal for well, it's not too bad at the moment because it's not strong details, but if you're painting fine details, it would just ruin the experience. So you can see I'm just blending in the colours, still just using the English uniform, just to get a nice transition. So it was just a case of, as I said, because it's quite a transparent colour, you just keep building up the layers, and then the stronger layer will be at the top, which creates that highlight effect. So it's quite nice to be able to create a transition just using one colour, basically, just from doing layers. And say if you were doing this as a really quick tabletop painting, you could get away with just using one colour. It still works in a very rough kind of non-metallic way. So now I'm going on to the Japanese uniform. You can see it's a much more yellow colour, and obviously lighter than the English uniform. So the idea here is exactly the same as when the English uniform was applied, but it's in a much smaller area. So you don't want to go down as far as you did with the English uniform. You don't want to cover the whole area, because that'll just wipe out what you've done. This is to just add brighter and more yellow highlights, so you're getting that nice yellow kind of gold without being, you know, completely yellow. So here you can see more clearly as well when I'm applying the paint that the model keeps moving. It's worth pointing out at this stage as well, the paint's a little bit thick. I've been struggling painting while doing this video because, again, the temperature has been so hot. You can see all the paints on the palette, they're already looking like they've dried out. It's just been so hot. It's been in the room that I'm painting at the minute. It's over 35 degrees. So yeah, even with a wet palette, it's not ideal. So just the same again, using the tip of the brush, doing very small marks, building up the highlights. And again, just focusing on the much smaller area, so you're not wiping out all that English uniform. If you find that you put too much paint down, or it gets to be a hard line between the two colours, you can always go back, dip the brush into the English uniform without washing it off, and then just carefully, very carefully apply the transition line, and the paint will mix on the brush and on the model as you apply it. So then you'll get a nice mid-tone between the two colours, and you know, you'll get that transition. That's important as well, to look at the lower details on the face. Obviously, as I said, the face is bent over a little bit, so it's quite heavily in shadow, but there are some details that are upraised and sharp, and those would catch the light. Sharp edges will catch light even in quite dark areas, but anything round, like the rivets, will catch a very small amount of light. You know, if it's a really dark area, they'll still catch light if it's available. So yeah, it's important to pick out those small sort of details. And also just a little bit of secondary highlights, which would be light reflecting from the ground and things like that. So you can see just on both sides, making sure to get a little bit of secondary highlight. It's not really necessary, but it just helps to form the shape of the face a little bit. I mean, it's not like it's got a very strong face anyway, but just to, you know, show there's something there anyway. So now on to the ice yellow. And you have to use this very sparingly. It's quite a strong colour. Again, you're applying it in the same way as the previous two colours, but this time only in the very highest points. It's quite important that you don't go too much over the Japanese uniform in particular, because that's keeping that yellow look to the gold. So if you take that away, you're going to be quite strongly desaturating it. So this is just to show the high highlight points. Now, of course, if you wanted, you could still take it a little bit higher with white. I will be using white dots on various other parts of non-metallic metal, but I didn't think it was necessary in this section, especially because it was a little bit covered by the hood. I'm going to be painting the unit champion, whatever it's called. Because he doesn't have a hood on, I will put a white dot in the centre of his highlight as well. But in this case, because there's so much black right next to the highlight areas, I didn't think it was really necessary, because that high contrast is already there. So you can see I'm putting this straight across the very top of the ridge on his face, and that's right next to the dark line that's created underneath the hood. So that really makes it pop out. See, the paint's drying too much still with the hot weather. It has been a bit of a trial to paint these videos under my camera with the lamps and everything, with the paint drying so much. So you can see that I made the paint a little bit too thick. Well, the weather made the paint a little bit too thick as it dried out, so it applied too strongly. So I'm just dipping the paintbrush in the Japanese uniform with the ice yellow still on the brush as well. So as I said, it's doing that thing where it just mixes it in a little bit and creates like a mid-tone between the two colours. And then almost kind of using pointillism in a way just to help blend the colours together. Now these aren't competition piece models, these are just for my army, so obviously you could take the painting that I've done and push it a few stages further just to make the blending perfect and make sure everything's, you know, really spot on. But it's not really necessary for these guys. They're already very bright and bold, so unless you want to do them for a competition, then I think this standard is fine for general kind of work. So I'm doing the face now on the champion. As I said, he's a little bit more complicated. There's a few reasons for this. The main reason is he doesn't have a hood, so you don't get that high contrast effect with the shadow line. That makes it really hard to get the shine without the high contrast. And the other issue is, and this is why this face takes a little bit longer than the other one, is that there's all dints and things on his mask, which mean that you don't get the smooth transitions all over you, and you have to kind of make those visible without making them too visible. So they have to be, you know, subtly blended in. So make sure to pick up the edges on the top of the mask as well. It's quite important, especially because the metal behind it is going to be kind of a steel sort of metal, and so you won't get the high contrast with it being black. So although you might, so it's important to remember that as well, that this needs to be fairly bright to really stand out, because you won't have the luxury of that black paint being there. It'll be kind of grey, going towards a white colour. Now you can see that I'm picking out some of the rivets and things like that. These obviously will be highlighted further than they are using this colour, which again is the English uniform, but it just keeps everything neat, and it makes it easier to visualise as you're painting along. One thing that I found really quite frustrating when painting this metal faceplate as well is some of the shadows and the dents in it make it look like eyes. And you can see as well just there the issue with that I mentioned before, with the thin tail connecting it to the base. The model just pings really easily. So that happens a few times throughout the painting process, and I have a couple of accidents as well, where the paint sticks on the model where it shouldn't have, as it headbutts the brush. So yeah, this champion's head, as I said, it's harder to paint than the other two heads in the squad, and I've already covered the dents and the hood. But also it doesn't have any strong details. Now the other two heads, you'll notice, have that big block going straight, like a mohawk going straight down the centre of the head. And because those are sharp edges, it makes it really easy for those bits to stand out. And also on the previous one that I just painted, it had like a chin section with like a little triangle point, which was only highlighted with the very edge. And what happens is, with details like that, it really helps to push the non-metallic metal effect, because you have such high contrast areas with just a bit of white, or the ice yellow, or whatever it was, just catching the edge, and it shows the light just catching it, and it gives that impression of the light catching hard edges and adds to the non-metallic metal effect. Whereas in this case, without any of those details, you're just left with this kind of smoothish, bumpy-ish surface. And if you have a look at something like that, if you find like an old copper kettle or whatever that's dinted, and it's not particularly shiny, and it's just got dints in, there's not a lot you can do to make it look non-metallic. There's plenty you can do, by just copying the reflections and things, but there aren't the easy tricks that you can use with the sharp edges and bits like that just to really emphasize that it's a shiny part of the model. Now what you can see here is, so I'm still painting some of the shapes. What I'm going to class as the forehead there, he's got these dark dents in it, but they are much too dark at this stage. What I'm going to do is keep building up the levels, and as I add more and more highlights, then I'll go back and soften these dents down, because at the minute they look like holes almost in the mask. And one other thing as well with these dents is that, especially the ones lower down on the face, they add kind of, you know, a little bit of a few extra surfaces, you know, with different angles. So depending on how much reflected light you want to add on the lower section of the face, some of these still have to catch the light a little bit just to show that that shape is there. So you can see there I've gone straight in with well, first the Japanese uniform and then going on to the ice yellow. Now obviously that's way too bright and not blended in enough, and so what I'm going to do is same technique again, where I keep putting the paintbrush in between the two colours, blending it in, so it would be like a mid-tone, because I need quite a lot of highlight on the forehead area. Because this is that's going to be the area that I'm really going to focus on to make it seem shiny. So here you can see I'm using the well, it's actually a mixture of English uniform. Japanese uniform and ice yellow mixed on the brush, and just using it to pick out the rivets on the head again. So you can see here, although things are highlighted and the general look of the highlights are in the right place, it's not looking very non-metallic metal still. And here you can see what I was talking about with the face. So about halfway down, so there's two holes there. I think of those as like brow holes, and just under those there's this heavy ridge. It looks like frowning eye sockets, and I can't decide if those were put there purposefully to make it look like the metal plate had been kind of hammered over someone's face. Which it quite probably could be supposed to be like that, because I know the Games Workshop designers like to have kind of a story to the models they make. So here I'm going back to the English uniform and softening in these transitions, getting rid of these dark holes, because the dents, although they're obvious on the model, they're still quite shallow. They shouldn't be super dark, but just, you know, leaving them there as I build up the highlights and then going back and kind of blending everything in, it just makes it easier to understand what I'm doing. So you can see now I'm highlighting underneath the those holes, but again they've got to be softened down more. But because the particularly the English uniform that I'll use to soften them down will be transparent, I can go over these highlights a little bit as well, and it'll just kind of it'll pull all the transitions together. You see as it goes along anyway. It's just a case that the mask itself is a little bit more difficult than the other shapes to make look, to give that kind of metal effect. Although also it could be said I'm being a little bit finicky with the look, and to some extent I think it looks fine as it is, but I just end up taking it a little bit further just because it's the unit champion and I wanted him to be a bit more of a centerpiece. So you can see here going back and getting in that Japanese uniform, and it's just making the yellow that bit stronger. Excuse my phone, keep buzzing. I've tried to move it away a bit, but I'm getting messages concerning my wedding in October, so they're quite important to do in this. It's hard to separate them from the recording the audio for the video. So now I'm using pure ice yellow for these top rivets to make them stand out. You'll see that I keep painting over this area, mixing the paint and blending it in, and some of that is to do with the transparency of the paint. So what you find is that when you apply the paint, the colour looks strong, and then as it dries it becomes more transparent, and that's because as the water evaporates out of it, it kind of it makes the layer thinner basically. But also it becomes less wet as well, so what you'll find is wet colours are stronger. So if you see something like red, it works with the gloss varnish as well. If you see something's red, you give it a very heavy matte coat, it'll look kind of dull, whereas if you give it a gloss coat, it'll look really deep and vibrant. And it's the same red colour, it's just a case of if it's matte or gloss. So yeah, when you apply the colours, obviously they're wet, so and they they're just taking the light better. So you can see just very small marks, keep going over it, blending things in. And to some extent it makes it look worse every now and then when I'm applying the highlights a little bit higher, but it doesn't matter because they get blended in more and more. I mean, there are different ways that you can do this as well. You could just go straight for a really, straight in there with the ice yellow, just really layer it on heavily and then blend it out from that, but I prefer to work up in stages. So what's happened here is you can see I've gone back and I've used the English uniform to soften in the dents and things, but also I've started doing glazes with Mournfang brown. So what I'm going to do is go back to the previous model and just do a few glazes of Mournfang brown to show you how that's added a little bit of warmth into the shadows and things like that. It just softens in the transition. It's unfortunate I didn't do that on the other model, but it's something that I just missed with the video, so that's why I'm going back to do it with this one. So what it is a glaze with the Mournfang brown. It's about 5:1 parts water to paint. You just dip the brush in the well palette. It's part of the well palette that comes from Redgrass Games that I've been trying out for the past month or so. It's quite a nice little well palette. It's only got 5 wells in it, but it does the job. So there you go. You dip the brush in the well palette, rub it off onto the kitchen towel, gently apply it. So this is back to the original model, and what we're going to be doing is I think the metal boxes on the ends of the chains. No, we're not. We're actually going to be painting the chains. This is the problem doing the voiceover. After you've painted it, I've got to remember what order I did things. Alright, so the chains are very, very simple. I'm using Skavenblight Dinge, which is the dark colour there, dark grey on the palette, and I'm just going to be picking out the shapes of the chains. This is quite a rough stage. Skavenblight Dinge doesn't have a great coverage, so it doesn't matter if you apply it a little bit heavily. And the idea is just to get you're covering the majority of the area, but on the big ring where the hands are holding, you want to pay attention to how the light catches the ring. So on the outer ring, it's on the upper edge, especially up near where, the inside of the hand, and on the lower ring, it's on the inside. The next colour, I took the model away there. I think that there's a bit of paint dried up on that I noticed on the model that I had to cut off. There you go, you can see that little white dot on the model, so I've just got to cover that over a little bit. So what happened is some bit of dirt had got in with the primer, and it was annoying me when I was painting the highlight, especially because it's exactly where the highlight would go. So I used model colour black just to fix that. So the next grey is a mix between Skavenblight Dinge and Celestra grey. You don't have to have that exact grey, it's just that it's a transition. So as long as it's lighter, like a couple of tones lighter than Skavenblight Dinge, and it's grey, it'll be fine for this stage. So this is where you actually really focus more on where the light points hit, because with the Skavenblight Dinge you would have covered most of these chain links in grey, just leaving the kind of the interlocking sections for the shadows. but now you're actually placing on the highlights quite specifically. So that's going to be on the upper edge of all the chain links, and on the big circle, metal circle that he's holding. Again, it's at the very top near where the inside of the hand is. On the bottom of the circle, it's on the inner edge. And to apply the highlight, start at the lower section of the highlight and then move up to where, towards the highest point. And then as you take the brush off, a little bit more paint will be left on that highest point. So you're almost getting a small transition in there as you apply just one mark for a highlight. So now going straight in for the white highest highlight, and this is just a small dot at the very top of each of these highlight points. I'm using Ceramite white, but the white they use doesn't really matter. So there you can see how the highlight makes it look really quite shiny at this stage. Now I'll just go back to that Celestra Grey and Skavenblight Dinge mix and add in a few secondary highlights. So these will be on the underside of things, generally next to where the white dot highlight goes, and that just shows the light reflecting off of the one section and catching the underside of another section. And these don't want to be highlighted any higher than that, they're just small little extra highlights reflected. So what these do is they kind of give a little bit more form to the chain, so it's not just upper edge highlights, it lets you see the bottom area of them as well. So you can see how quick and easy that was to paint in and look like non-metallic metals. Now of course, painting it there, it's not worked on that side, there's no paint there, so then you have to do the same thing again. And this is the same for all of the non-metallic metals all over the model, apart from the heads. The heads are the easiest of the non-metallic metals because they generally only need to be done from one direction. You can see here how the hood covers most of the face. So you know, you only need to see that small curve of the head at the front. But obviously the chains and the metal boxes, they can be viewed from all the way around, so obviously you have to twist the model quite a bit and paint it from a few different directions. Now this is, I said, for my army, gaming army, I'm not completely bothered about the highlights from the very back underneath the model. Because that gets blocked a little bit by the blue glowy bit from the back of it. But it is obviously important to, you know, get all the highlights from the side, opposite side to the ones you painted already. So again, exactly the same process. Skavenblight Dinge and Celestra Grey mix, picking out the highlights that you've put on. You can see just about how the light's catching the model anyway, so where I'm putting these highlights, there's already light showing you where the highlights need to go. So this will just be on the inside of the curve, and if you notice there was already a highlight point there where the actual light from my lamp had been hitting the black, or rather the Skavenblight Dinge, because I'd already painted it. So what I'm doing on this side is, just to make it a little bit different, is putting the highlight on the bottom left of the chain links. So it's top right, bottom left. It doesn't really matter too much with your positioning. You can play around with it a bit, because you only get to see the model from that one angle when you look at the highlight. So if you turn it around, the light can be hitting it differently from the light on the other side. Just doing the highest point now, using the Ceramite white again. And you can see, especially on the big loop, how those light points really make it look like shiny metal. And just adding in a few little points of secondary highlights, just to make it show that the light is bouncing around off of sections, and just, you know, it just gives a little bit more shape to the chains. Very quick and simple way to paint non-metallic metal chains. And so what I'm doing here is just giving it a quick coat of Agrax Earth Shade. Now I'm doing this because when I was looking at the chain, I thought it looks really bright and really, really clean, and I just wanted to have a slight amount of and just to dull it down just a tiny amount. It doesn't make a massive difference, but it just softens it a bit, so it's not super bright, because I didn't want the chains to be so bright they took over from the other parts on the model. But it's quite an optional stage, that. So now we're painting the red on the cloak. So obviously, as I said, it already had a quick airbrush of Mephiston red. Here I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet just to do some of the first highlights, and I will go back and mix that in with Mephiston red as well, because some of the cloak details will be painted in that aren't actually on the model. I'll just paint in lines anyway to make it look like creases, and other parts are actually creases, but they should all hopefully blend together. So you can, here I'm using Wild Rider red. Now obviously the Wild Rider red looks quite orange. I sometimes get the name wrong, call it Wild Rider orange. What I'm doing here is kind of a sort of a wet blending sort of technique, where I'm just mixing the paints on the model. So what you're going to see is I'm jumping backwards and forwards between stages. If you want to be a little bit more focused on how you apply it, you can do all these stages at once rather than keep, jumping around. But I just wanted to get some of these things defined. So what I'm doing here is using Abaddon black turned into a glaze, which is again about 5:1 parts water to paint. Just be a little bit careful. Maybe give it a test on the model, because you don't want the black too strong. But what I'm doing is putting this glaze on, and it's separating the sections between the red and the blue. I will be going back and glazing over parts as well. But if there's a hard edge detail, then it needs to be glazed underneath that hard edge with the black on any area that's in shadow. So all this side area will be shadowed in. And I'm also using it as a quick wash just to go around the details on the hood, these little rivets. You don't have to use the black. It's probably easier if you actually use one of the washes, whatever the black wash colour is from Games Workshop, because that'll just work a little bit easier. But I'm not overly concerned. It's just a quick way to get a dark ring around those rivets, so that when I paint in the gold shine on them, it'll have a bit of contrast there. You can see how the water tension pulls the paint around the rivets anyway. But don't put too much on, because it will spread out far, then it will dry, sink in, and you'll get a tea stain effect, and it'll actually be darker just on that edge of that tea stain, so that'll be quite messy. So back to Evils and Scarlet, and painting more of these details. Now here I've gone back to the Mephiston red, and I'm now going to paint down some of these creases to actually give shape, rather than just being a big blob of shadow here. You're going to find that I'm going to swap between these red colours quite a lot, keep going backwards and forwards, and that just allows me to blend them together, especially because of the heat and the paint drying. It's just making painting that a little bit harder. So So here's where you can see why I say that the airbrush doesn't make a big difference, because you're basically painting over all of the red of the base colour anyway. It just makes it easier to visualise what you're doing. It does help a little bit, especially on around the head, the hood on the head, because that's going to stay quite strong red. But the red that's been airbrushed on it looks fairly dark because of the red base coat, so you're already getting like a head start with the layering, but you're still painting on top of that, so the airbrush doesn't make a huge difference to the final piece. So what I'm saying is, if you don't have an airbrush and you want to paint them just the same way as this, all it is a case of just doing more layers. So still start with that black primed model, then paint all the areas red that you want to be red. You'll just have to glaze the black to get the softer edge quickly. But yeah, it's still fairly simple. That thing that's waving in front of this screen is actually my hair. I've got a fan outside the door blowing across. And that's also not helping to keep the paints wet. You can see here some of these nice little folds, shapes on the sleeve. Just to pick out those details. You don't have to make sure everything's bright red. In fact, it looks brighter as long as you keep things dark near it, because you get that contrast. It's the contrast that makes things pop out. And that's why I've got these heavy shadows going down the sides. Then you just pick out the edges. So these models, I think, are supposed to have 2 layers, but I'm not purposefully separating them out in between a red layer and a blue layer, because obviously the sleeves would be underneath, so they should be a blue layer, but I think they look better as being red. So what I'm just doing is, as I said, separating it kind of with the black area, but the red edges on that top, on like the red covering on top, it's got the hood on it, they just added a bit more interest, so it's not just an amorphous shadow separating it out. So here I am adding the Wild Rider Red. It's quite a strong layer of highlight. As I said, it looks very orange. It's kind of pinky orange. So you don't want to go too over the top when you're applying this. This is mainly for the more concentrated highlight points and the edges of things. And also because I want the head to be slightly more of a focal point, so the head, especially this little trim that goes around the hood, that's picked out just a little bit higher than the rest of the model. Just going back in there. Oh, I've got some of the black glaze on the shoulder. So all I've done there is taken a bit of water from my water jar and just washed it away. Now I was blowing on it to help the water evaporate quicker. But what I did before that was just to put that black glaze in between, in the crease between the hood and the shoulder. So that's again adding a bit more tonal contrast. Everything about these models, these Nighthaunt that I'm painting, it's all about contrast, making everything really stand out. I wanted them to be very visual on the tabletop, so they're kind of the opposite of how most people envision ghosts and things that are very see-through, with old subdued clothing and you know, rusty weapons and things like that. I really wanted mine to be very bold and in your face, because these ghosts are coming to kill you, so there's that, you can clearly see them coming at you as an army. And also just, I like the high contrast colours. It's quite a tricky section just here between the shoulder and the head, because it's very easy to have to catch the side of the brush on one or other of the sections. And this is a good area to talk about actually the size of brushes, because lots of people say you can use a size 2 or size 3 brush for everything. If you're using a size 2 brush to paint in that little fine line there, is so much easier to catch the edges because the brush is fatter. The point might still be sharp, but the as it goes more towards the body of the brush, it's obviously much wider, and so you don't have that much space to move the brush before you catch another section with paint that you don't want to be there. So you can see just very small marks now, just to improve the blending, make sure it all looks nice and fairly smooth. And just again to reiterate, these are for my army, so it's not the most impressive painting ever, but if you wanted to take it a step further you can. It's just a case of just pushing it with glazes and small marks until it looks a lot smoother, or textured, whatever effect you're going for. All of these highlights are based on the light coming from a top-down perspective, so it has to be consistent, especially because of the non-metallic metal effect. All the light is obviously coming from above, and that's where the shines are always from above. So if you've done that on all of the metal areas, you have to do the same for all the cloth areas as well. So here I've just actually painted a crease on the sleeve that isn't sculpted on there, just for a bit more detail. So here I'm using Fire Dragon Bright. It's a very small amount of Fire Dragon Bright in general. You've got to be careful when applying it because it's obviously an orange colour, and if you put too much orange down you're just going to make everything look orange. You don't want to take away the red because you'll lose that vibrant red colour. Obviously I'm having to water down the ice yellow again. All the colours are trying out too much in the heat, as I mentioned before. So I'm just using the Japanese uniform to pick out a few of the rivets. Oh, and there's a model pinged and it got paint all around the rivet area, and that's bad. So again, I just quickly popped the brush in some water and rubbed it off. It's just diluting it. If you examined it under a microscope, you could probably see traces of the paint, but for the purposes here, it's good enough just to quickly rub it off with some paint, with water. No, don't rub it off with paint. So here we go. I'm just picking them out again in ice yellow. The rivets on this one weren't quite as well defined as the previous model that I painted. They're a bit bigger and softer. I don't think they look quite as interesting. They just look a little bit less refined. If I was painting this as a competition piece though, because those rivets are bigger on the hood, I could have painted those with multiple reflections and things. But in this case I'm not going to. Right, so now we're going to be painting the spooky trails. So obviously these have already been started to be airbrushed on as well. One quick note, so you see I'd already painted one of the chains on. I haven't painted the chain over the blue section that we're painting now. And the reason for that is that you're really likely to get paint on it with these long draw marks, especially as they go right underneath the chain that's stuck there. So yeah, don't paint the chains before the blue or whatever. I think one of the other models has the chains going over the red. Again, paint the chains last. It was just happened that I did them at that stage on the video, but for general use, just to make it easy for yourself, paint the chains probably last. Alright, so for these streaks, you can already see that I'm already painting over the top section of the airbrush work, and it was really bad airbrush work anyway. I just did it really quickly. You can see speckles of paint and all sorts of rubbish on. So this first colour is Sotek green, not actually blue, and that's quite important because the green adds a nice little bit more contrast with the red. I mean, it is a very bluey green, to be fair, but that's the first stage, is you add the streaks on with the Sotek green. Now if you haven't airbrushed these blue ghosty bits all the way to the bottom, then you would have to paint the Sotek green all the way to the bottom, which you could do with lots and lots of streaks, just carrying on the streaks all the way down. You can see how the chains are getting in the way there, because you always want to paint starting at the top and going down towards the bottom, because as I've mentioned numerous times, when you take the brush off of the model, wherever the paintbrush leaves is where the most paint is on the model. Now again, if you just wanted to do these really quickly, you could just paint these streaks on and then be done. You don't need to do them quite as involved as I am. So here we're going into Lothern blue. Now again, this is just pretty much just covered all of the bottom airbrush work anyway, but it just means that it's another layer on top of that, so you get a more opaque look to it. Now here you can see that I'm going back and using the Sotek green again, and this it just softens in some of these transitions, and also kind of adds more of that green look to it. So the Lothern blue is to pick out, you're basically going on top of all the lines that you've already painted, and also picking out some of the edge work, just to give it a hard edge, basically define the edge. Now you can see how I paint the brush strokes on. You don't want these streaky lines to be very, you don't want to be very hard. You don't want to just paint one long slow line then keep going over that one slow line, and because you just end up with very hard lines that they don't look natural at all. Whereas these kind of soft lines, so I'm going over that, you know, you don't have to get the lines perfectly on top of each other. They can look very rough. There's going to be some black glazes to soften at the top as well, and it makes it look more like creases and multiple layers rather than really hard defined lines. I know that sounds strange because obviously I'm going on top of the lines I've already painted. I'm saying don't do that. Obviously do that, but don't do them too strong. You can see here how I'm blending some of the lines together, because I don't want those hard black lines in between. You can see here this section is a little bit lighter than those next to it, and that's because it's more curved on the outside, so it's to show that more light's hitting it, just to add a little bit of shape to the model as well. So this blue is Lothern blue mixed with Ceramite white. This goes all the way to the bottom. So should be taking. You don't want the dark lines should finish quite high up. You don't want dark lines going all the way to the end of these, because it'll just look too harsh. So the idea is to try and make them look a little bit ghostly, without those hard lines, so kind of almost transparent, while still adding the line detail. So here you can see the Lothern blue and white Ceramite again, this time taking it all the way to the bottom. And this is where the airbrush work helped a little bit with the layer, because it's a touch darker, so you get to put these lines on, highlight lines, quickly, and they look they work fairly well. So just there you saw me go back to using the Sotek green, and I'm using that to soften this curve in the fabric, or whatever it is, ghostly material. So I'm using it as kind of a shadow, but without using black, so it's still keeping that kind of ghostly look to it, and it softens the lines in between, you know, that I keep talking about, these dark lines, but it also keeps it different from the black fade in at the top, in between the red and the blue. So although you can see me at the minute softening in at the top there as well with the Sotek green, I'm still going to glaze over the top section a bit with Abaddon black, because I don't really want these lines touching the red. I want that to be almost pure black as it fades down into the ghostly lines. So you can see, although there are obviously stages of going from the base colour, then lines of Sotek green, Lothern blue mixed with Ceramite white, and then the black glazing that I'm about to do. I still go backwards and forwards with all the colours just to help blend things together and add a bit of colour, because keep going back, especially with the Sotek green, when I keep going back, it's adding more green to areas of the blue. So although the overall colour is blue, it's just adding a little bit more interesting colour variation in there. So this is again glazing black, 5 parts water, 1 part paint. It's quite a strong glaze, this one. I wouldn't ever recommend having, well, don't on a light colour, don't glaze something this strong over a light colour. Even here you can see actually where I've got some of the glaze on top of the blue, it's leaving quite a strong mark. If you wanted to do subtle glazing with lots of layers and make it for competition standard, add more water, and then of course more layers. So there you can see kind of almost a tide mark. So I've now got to fix. So back with the Sotek green. There's the tide mark pretty much gone. And really it's lots of these little small marks that are built up that are making it look at the way it does. So that's what I was saying earlier, don't put those really strong thick lines on, because they'll just be, they'll just be too obvious and too hard. It's lots of these small lines and then softening them together in multiple layers. That's what gives you this nice soft effect with the nice subtle colour variations. It's just a case of picking out small areas to make, take all the way up to white pretty much. But don't do that all over, just in a few small areas, and it'll, then it makes those areas pop out, but it just makes everything look interesting because you have that high contrast. So here's the Ceramite white, just as the little finishing touches. And obviously in these sections that I'm showing you, I'm only painting small areas. And the rest is left unfinished. You would obviously have to do the whole model, but I'm just doing small areas to show you how to do specific sections. So here you can see where I've painted this side of the ghost, strangly bits, kind of like the blue bits at the bottom anyway. So in the finished model, those are also painted on the inside, so you can see that the long one that attaches to the base. That also needs to be done in the same technique. It's a little bit more tricky because obviously it's on the inside of the model, and it wasn't worth me showing you how to paint that on the inside of the model because you just wouldn't be able to see most of the brush marks anyway. So there you can see that I've actually put a few of the marks down. I've also painted on the gold metal band around his arm, and painted the metal arm. not metal arm, sorry, the blue arm. The arm is painted exactly the same colours as the ghostly material coming out the bottom. And the metal arm was painted the same way as the highlights on the head. So here I'm painting the metal boxes on the end of the chains. I think they're weights to hold it down. I guess they're to represent the burden of its existence and to hit people with. That'll be what the spikes are there for, I guess. So what I'm using is Fire Dragon Bright to start with, just to get the general direction of the lighting. Now the way that I've painted these boxes is they're sort of non-metallic metal. They're very high contrast, but I haven't spent too much time working out the light directions and making sure they're accurate. I've just done them roughly, so it's faux non-metallic. It's basically to make, it's just the high contrast that's making it work, because I just needed something that I could do very quickly over the whole model, because there's 4 sides to each box as well as the end, and if I spent too long doing all the non-metallics properly with reflected light and things like that, it would just take too long for army painting. So it's I think it still works quite nicely, and the high contrast in particular makes it kind of interesting to look at. So the reason that I'm doing it at a slight angle is because the box is obviously angled, excuse me, angled as well, and then the edge highlights where the light would roughly catch. As I mentioned before, when you're painting in highlights, edges really catch the light. So as long as you paint every upper edge with the ones closest to the light source the brightest, which is what the white dots will be at the end, it will give that illusion of the material being metal. So I've started off with the Fire Dragon Bright. Now it's quite hard to get a nice finish using Fire Dragon Bright straight on top of black. When you first apply it, you're going to notice that it looks a little bit patchy and just not nice to look at. So you're going to need to do multiple layers. Don't be tempted to thicken the paint and apply it, because you'll just lead to texture build-up. And you don't really want that, unless you want it to look like a rusty box, in which case then texture is fine, but you want to use different colours. So the main colour that's going to pick up all the highlight points to start with is the Fire Dragon Bright, and as I said, it's tilted to one side because the box is tilted one side, so it's kind of roughly, I mean, I haven't balanced it properly, but it's kind of roughly to be create kind of a horizon line, but it's not a horizon line for reflecting the horizon. It's just that I want it to look level with the model. So again, I'm doing the same thing on this side. I'm actually cheating a little bit because again, I'm painting this inside section as also at an angle, and that shouldn't really be at an angle, but it's so that it works next to the hard highlight on the front. Because as I said, non-metallics kind of work where it's light next to dark with the high contrast. So I'm doing the same pattern all the way around the box, because then it'll work all the way around from every angle. And I mean, it still works, but obviously if you wanted realistic non-metallic metal, then the highlight is in the wrong place. But the benefit of this kind of non-metallic metal thing is that it works as you rotate the model all the way around, because it'll always be light next to dark from every angle, rather than having to fudge certain angles as you turn the model, because obviously the light changes on how it hits the model. In this case, because I've not used a realistic light source, I've just made it work light next to dark all the way around. It works particularly well because it's a box shape as well, so very hard edges and flat surfaces. Alright, so on the wet palette, it doesn't quite fit on the screen. I'm adding Ushabti bone at the bottom there, and that's going to be the main highlight colour. So the black primer is the kind of base colour. The Ushabti bone puts all the highlight placement, not this, the Fire Dragon Bright, sorry, puts all the highlight placement on, and then the highlights are all refined with the Ushabti bone. And the Ushabti bone is pretty much the final highlight that you're going to use all over, apart from the white dots at the end. Just adding a bit more water to the Fire Dragon Bright, because again it's drying out quite a bit. So this is the same as all the other non-metallic metals. The Ushabti bone goes over the strongest area of the Fire Dragon Bright to increase the contrast between light and dark. And it also takes away some of that orange colour. You don't want to go over the whole of the orange, because one, that entirely defeats the purpose of putting orange down to begin with. And also it means that you've lost the colour as well, like that warm colour, and it won't look like the right metal anymore. Now of course you don't have to do it this colour metal. You could use the same colours like the English uniform, Japanese uniform, etc. But I wanted it to be a bit more of a kind of a brass or bronzy kind of metal. Just really high contrast versions of it. You can see I keep stopping, it's because the paint's drying on the tip of the brush. Right, so here I've got glaze of Mournfang brown again. This was the same that I used on the gold on the faceplate, and it's done for exactly the same reason here. But it also softens in the orange into the black. But what I did find is that it was taking too long. So if you just put some Mournfang brown on the wet palette, and you can then kind of use very small marks to blend it in as well. There's no need to spend a long time on these boxes really. And just going back using the Fire Dragon Bright just to pick out the colour again after it's been dulled down with the Mournfang Brown. What you'll find is very small marks with mixing the colours, going back and forwards all the time. It just builds up into nice colour combinations. And even the edge highlights as well. You see, I keep going over them after I've painted other parts. You know, they get dulled down a little bit here and there, and then keep going over with the higher highlights as I go along. You might think, well, why don't you just wait until the end and put the highlight on the highest highlight? But actually, what you find is you do get small amounts of paint that still can be seen, so it looks more like a nice transition. Having multiple layers with the different colours built up rather than just having one highlight colour straight on top. So again, the highest highlight at the moment is still Ushabti bone. Just using a little bit of Rhinox hide just to tidy up where I'd caught the edge there. And again, Mournfang Brown, soften everything up, give it that warm, nice feeling. A little bit more Fire Dragon Bright. Very small marks. Building up layers, making it look nice. And finally, just some white dots. Really, I should have watered down the white again because it just dried out. But and you can see the blobs are a bit thick, but it doesn't matter too much because it just shows some the glint being stronger. And you see just those small white dots make a big difference to the contrast, because it's again taking it from pure black to pure white. So on this side, it's again just the same thing that we did on the front side. Just painting on the Fire Dragon Bright, highlights with Ushabti bone, blending in a little bit with Mournfang Brown. Just keep going backwards and forwards. Edge highlights with the Ushabti bone, and then a dot of white again. And again, you just do the same pattern on every side, because then it'll work from all the way around. So here you can see the edge highlight. Now the nice thing is with this edge highlight, it works in two ways. One, it adds a highlight to the front side, which creates a hard edge there, and that highlight blends in with all the orange and Mournfang brown already on that side. Then from this side, it creates a very hard line between the black of the primer and that Ushabti bone highlight, so it works as a sharp edge highlight from this direction. In some ways these metal boxes are quite nice. I keep calling them metal boxes, they might not be hollow, metal weights, whatever they are. They're quite nice with all the edges on them because it makes it really easy. All the sharp edges, as I said, allow you to just put a hard line on them, which creates instant high contrast. Whereas, as you could see when I painted the face on the Unic Champion, those soft curves and things without any hard lines made it much easier to get that much harder to get that high contrast. So I made a little mistake there and just gone into that hard line recess in between the trim and the flat panel. So just using a little bit of Mournfang brown, just to tone down a little bit the bright Ushabti bone. And again using the Rhinox hide. So Rhinox hide isn't going to be listed as a paint that you need for painting these non-metallic metal weights because I don't use it as part of the transition, but I am using it to fix faults because it's not quite as hard as if I put a black line there. A black line would be very high contrast and it just stands out a little bit more than it needs to. I mean, if you wanted, you could use the Rhinox hide as part of the transition, just between the Mournfang brown and the black still, depending on how smooth you want it. As I say, if you wanted to take this the painting to a higher standard and just make everything really super smooth, then maybe Rhinox hide would be worth using as part of that transition stage. When painting on these edge highlights, try and use the side of the tip of the brush. Obviously don't use too far down the brush, because then what you'll find is the tip brushes against parts that you don't want to get paint on. but if you just use the side of the tip, it just makes it that little bit easier to get the hard edges, to catch them. You can see again the paints on the wet palette have dried out quite quickly. Again, that's not a knock on Redgrass's palette. This, I think all palettes would be drying out in these conditions rapidly. And again, just little white dots. You might notice that when I'm applying these white dots, I'm not rubbing the paintbrush on my finger. It's a little bit more risky, but what it does is it creates a strong blob when you apply the paint, and the paint's already quite thick, so it's not going to spread out too far. It just creates a very strong, pigment-rich mark. But if I was going to drag the paintbrush at all doing those marks, I would strongly recommend that you rub the paintbrush against your finger or along the palette or something, just to get the paintbrush into a sharp point, because otherwise it will make a mess. Right, so this is going to be the lock on the champion. It's going to be exactly the same process that I've just done on the metal weights on the chains for the other two models. I'm just doing it on this one because it's obviously a much bigger area, so it makes it a tiny bit more tricky, but also because it's a bigger area you'll see more clearly. It's also much more level, so you can see it painted evenly rather than at an angle. So an interesting thing to look at here, the Fire Dragon Bright, as I'm applying it, you can see what I was talking about when I was saying that the paint isn't ideal when you paint it over black, because it leaves, you can see lots of marks and things like that, which is true. But also part of the reason for that is because the paint has started to dry, and then I've added water to it, and then started to dry and add water to it, and it changes the how the paint works, basically. So if you get fresh paint straight from the pot and add a little bit of water to it so it runs nicely, you get much smoother marks and more pigment rich marks. Whereas these ones, what happens is when you keep adding the water to it and they dry, it's some of the pigment has sunk to the bottom and dried completely on the paper, and you always lose a little bit of pigment out of the paint as you keep adding more water, and then it dries and you add more water. So what you end up with is it gets closer to a wash, and it doesn't matter how much you let it dry, it still never goes back to its original consistency. Even if the consistency seems the same, it's still there's less pigment in it, and it just doesn't make as nice marks. So sometimes in these cases it's better to use fresh paint than just keep adding more water to what you've already got. But again, it depends what kind of marks you're doing. In some ways it's nice to use the paint that's already been watered down and dried a few times, because it's much easier to make softer marks. So here I'm using, so I actually put some fresh paint on top of the old paint as well, so it just made it a little bit easier to make the marks here. You can see how before they were very kind of scratchy when they were applied, now they look much smoother. So I'm doing exactly the same process, going around. All the upper edges and side edges are getting picked out in the Fire Dragon Bright. Because it's very level, I'm painting both left and right sides, whereas because on the metal weights on the previous model it was at an angle, it was only the upper edge and the left hand edge that was getting a highlight. Although, well, that's not entirely true, because obviously as you turned the faces round, the other edge was getting a highlight, but it wasn't. It was in a different way. So these edge highlights are next to black sides. Obviously you have to paint the top sections as well on this. Which will then work next to the dark edges on the top of the front panel and then create contrast there. On these angled bits at the side, they again want to be highlighted at the bottom and then fade out a little bit towards the top. So again, you keep that contrast because the flat panel that's very flat next to the angled panel will then have a bit of shadow next to the hard orange edge. And of course, in the curve in the middle, underneath the metal lock loop, that needs to be stronger in the middle and then fade out towards the edges so that it shows the light catching in the middle. So here I'm going straight into the Ushabti bone. You might notice that as I applied the orange, it wasn't perfectly evenly applied all over. It's a little bit rough, but that's because as I apply more layers, eventually it'll kind of all blend in. But again, if you wanted this for competition standard, you probably should take a little bit longer over it. You'll also notice that it's a little bit harder doing this with these colours on the larger area because you have to use larger areas of the Ushabti bone, and that takes away the colour, so it looks really desaturated in that area and not shiny enough. So what you'll find is as I go along, I'll pull the colour down so that the Ushabti bone isn't quite such a large area. So this is going to be the last thing I show you how to paint on the video, because that should then have covered all the different materials and parts on the models, so you'll be able to use the different sections of the video to see how to complete the whole model basically. Here again I'm using the Ushabti bone just to pick out the vertical and horizontal lines and upper edges. Don't ever use the Ushabti bone on the lower edges because it'll be too strong. Sometimes if you go really high on the edge highlights, you can use one of the darker colours as a secondary highlight on the lower edges because that would also work. You can see again that I had a paint problem there where the model flicks and go back to the Rhinox hide and just fix up some bits. For some reason as well on the lock, this one of the rivets was bigger than all the others. I'm not entirely sure why that was, but and then back to Mournfang brown to soften in, and also the Mournfang brown's a bit more important on the large flat panels for this piece because otherwise there's going to be lots of areas of basically black. And you need the contrast to make everything look shiny, but it would just be too much black, so it's just allowing you to create a bit more transition colour in there. Now actually it would also be a good area to add the Rhinox hide on the top of the transitions. Now I didn't bother to do that, but it will make your life easier. If you find there's too much black, use a bit of Rhinox hide at the top to just push the transition a bit further up. But the same effect can be achieved by just doing glazed layers of Mournfang brown. You also, if you just take a moment and look at the head on the this model now, you can see where I put, it's not quite super clear, but you can see where I put the white dot in the middle of those highlights, and it just makes it look much more metallic looking now. Just keep applying these glazes of Mournfang brown. And then I've gone back again to Fire Dragon Bright just to add a little bit more colour back where I've gone a bit too far with the Mournfang brown. Don't worry about the rivets on this, just paint over them. You just spend too long. Keep going around them, because what you'll find is that when you put the highlights on at the end with the rivets with the bright dots, they'll look fine anyway. You can see here that I'm doing horizontal brush strokes, and that helps a little bit to blend them in, blend in the transitions, because I've just been doing vertical lines beforehand. So normally I'd recommend doing these horizontal crosshatch lines, because it helps to disguise faults in the paintwork, and it just works better to blend things together. But it really just depends. In this case it's better because the area is a bit larger, so it just speeds up the process of blending it together. But generally, because especially on the metal weight box things that I've been doing, they're smaller, so faults in the paint don't show up that much, and it's not really worth spending too much time on. So you can see, just keep tweaking all the little bits until you get kind of something that looks like a rough transition there. So this is where the strong highlight will make things really pop out and just give it a really nice finished touch. So the keyhole here, using the Ushabti bone, just picking out all the horizontal and vertical lines that face upwards. I mean, vertical lines don't face upwards, obviously, so all the vertical lines and horizontal lines that face upwards, and also obviously all of the rivets as well. Just picking out the edges a little bit, because obviously since I first put the paint down, I've caught them with the Mournfang brown and various marks of Fire Dragon Bright. So you can just see how that edge highlight really made the whole shape pop out. It's defined the hard edges on the shape and to really push the contrast. Then again, the wet palette's dried out quite a bit, so I've added a little bit more water just to get the white wet again. And then this will be the final highlight to really just make bits stand out and shine. So especially there in the center of that curve and on the corners just catch the light a little bit more as well. Just picking out the rivets as well. And the main parts of the keyhole, it just makes it, you know, it pushes the highlights higher basically. So yeah, that's pretty much at the end of the video for showing you how to paint these Chainghast models. Originally I was planning to complete the one model on its own all the way through the video, but I found out that 5 hours of painting just wouldn't I'd be cutting stages and things, and I think just showing you how to do each stage gives you enough information so you can transfer it to the whole model. So there's a photo of the finished squad, and you should well, you can now see how they all look together as final pieces. I think it works quite nicely, and I'm looking forward to seeing if I can get a whole army to look like this. So there might be a few more videos for the Nighthaunts. But that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.